Greetings, intrepid system failure listeners. Nate here with your weekly essay read. This one entitled Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll, and subtitled How Roman Counterculture Shaped Christianity. But first, a little preamble. Death and rebirth are central themes of Christianity, both in its mythology, the story of Jesus is about coming back from the dead, and in its actual history. Christianity resurrected dead and dying older traditions and carried them forward into the Middle Ages and beyond. Three major examples, all readily allegorized by death and rebirth, are debt forgiveness, astronomical cycles, and ego death. These are the three main layers of Christian source material. The experience of ego death suggests that the physical world is an illusion, an insight that is the basis of magic in the historical sense. Political authority stops people from having this experience because it threatens an economic order in which the poor make money on behalf of the rich. The poor won't reliably show up to work if they discover that work is an illusion. Early Christians presented a magical challenge to Roman authorities by appealing directly to the economically disadvantaged and emphasizing long-term economic sustainability with references to astronomical cycles and debt forgiveness. Magic is the perennial foil to power, as we will see again in the Renaissance. This essay in one sentence. The classic trope of Dionysus, the resurrected wine god of the Greeks, was recycled both by the Bacchanalian cult during the Roman Republican period and by Christianity during the Roman imperial period. Both were countercultural drug cults persecuted as part of a broader class war. And now, without further ado, here's Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll, How Roman Counterculture Shaped Christianity. The Modern Drug War. The Nixon administration passed the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, which introduced heavy penalties for the possession of drugs like magic mushrooms, heroin, and marijuana. These substances were all placed in the most restrictive Schedule I category, indicating a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. According to Nixon's chief domestic advisor, John Ehrlichman, the Controlled Substances Act had nothing to do with public health. In a 1994 interview with journalist Dan Baum, he stated, quote, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." Unquote. The Controlled Substances Act was a legal pretext to crack down on prominent opposition to the Vietnam War. It illustrates how the line between illegal contraband and sanctioned medicine exists not to serve public health, but to serve political purposes. The Ancient Drug War. The Second Punic War ended in 201 BC with a dramatic Roman victory over the Carthaginians. Inevitably, the spoils of war were not distributed evenly. The Roman oligarchy instead seized most of the conquered territory and slaves for themselves. They combined these into vast slave farms called latifundia. All that cheap slave labor drove down agricultural prices below what non-slave farms could sustain. Because they couldn't compete with slaves, Rome's small farmers were financially ruined. When they couldn't pay their debts, mass foreclosures delivered their family estates into the hands of the already wealthy, who used it to expand their latifundia even further. These mass foreclosures outraged a working class that had fought and bled to defend Rome from Hannibal. Having their family farms foreclosed upon wasn't the reward they expected for their service to the Republic. Displaced from their lands, these desperate farmers poured into Rome from the countryside. By 186 BC, the Roman Senate feared they had a revolution on their hands. Meanwhile, the cult of the wine god Bacchus had exploded in popularity. The all-night Bacchanalian raves were presided over by women. Cultists played raucous music and mixed wine with powerful psychoactive ingredients in emulation of the Greek worship of Dionysus. This Roman version of sex, drugs, and rock and roll proved every bit as alluring as the American version would 2,000 years later. And just as it did during the Vietnam War era, this trinity became the vehicle for a backlash against the political establishment. That's why the Senate cracked down on the Bacchanalia. Like Nixon, they feigned concern for the youth as a pretext to eliminate a political threat with state power. It was a bloodbath. According to the Roman historian Livy, thousands of cultists were put to death. The Senate didn't abolish the Bacchanalia. Instead, it subordinated the edgy cult of Bacchus into a milquetoast, state-sanctioned celebration under the control of the political authorities. Christianity. The Senate's crackdown on the cult of Bacchus was a success. It forestalled the revolt, and the Senate clung to power for another century of class struggle before Roman society's grotesque wealth inequality finally erupted into civil war. For 500 years, the Roman oligarchy had used its control of the Senate to fleece the working class at every turn. Finally, in 49 BC, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon stream with his army and marched on Rome as a populist politician advocating for the poor. By then, the situation was so incendiary that only an autocrat could hold Roman society together. After the ensuing period of civil war, Rome would primarily be ruled by emperors for the rest of her history, while the Senate was reduced to a largely ceremonial role. This titanic class struggle was the historical backdrop against which Christianity emerged. Jesus' hostility towards the established economic hierarchy is evidenced by his fierce advocacy for the poor and by his violent treatment of moneylenders in the Temple of Solomon. Early Christians were involved in the renewed class war that marked the end of the Roman Republic and, around Jesus' time, the dawning of the Roman Empire. They revived and incorporated many of the rituals and symbols of the old Bacchic cult, repressed by the Senate a century before. These included the eating or drinking of the flesh or blood of the gods, ecstatic or rapturous states of mind, speaking in tongues, and, most crucially, a rebellious opposition to the prevailing economic hierarchy. The histories of the Bacchanalia and Christianity are so intertwined that the Vatican Museum is filled with statues of Bacchus and his Greek predecessor, Dionysus. On a recent trip there, our tour guide felt compelled to acknowledge all the pagan statuary. He explained that Christianity recycled older sets of symbology to make the new faith broadly comprehensible to the inhabitants of the Roman Empire. The title card to this essay is a photo from the Apostolic Palace, taken by the author, of a mosaic depicting implements of Bacchic worship. Among them are the ceremonial Cantharos cup, a magic wand called a thyrsus used to mix the psychedelic wine, and a drum-like musical instrument called a tympanum. These are the symbols of the old Roman counterculture, their version of sex, drugs, and rock and roll that early Christians adopted during the fall of Rome. Well, alrighty, folks, that's it for this week's audio essay. If you'd like to view this essay in your web browser, that way you can see the title card that I just referenced, and you can also view the further materials where we've got the expanded article by Dan Baum and a link to the entire thing, and also a nice passage from Livy's Ab Urbe Condita. You can see that essay at systemfailure.org, and while you're there, you can enter in your email address and sign up to receive these essays in your email inbox every week. That way you shan't worry about missing one. And if you'd like to get in touch with either Brian or myself, you can accomplish that over at systemfailure.org. And we hope to see you online. With that, folks, we'll be back on Monday with another regularly scheduled edition of the System Failure Podcast with Brian. We'll see you then. Have a great week.